All right, hello everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm so excited to be having this event today about domestic climate migration in the United States. And I think, it's hard to imagine an issue that is more urgent or more timely. Thinking about the tens of thousands of people who've been displaced by the wildfires in California, or the hundreds of thousands of people who are still rebuilding after Hurricane Helene last year. This issue gets more timely every day. In fact, at a certain point, you start to ask yourself, when wouldn't there be a crisis occurring in the background of a conversation about climate? So thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be talking to you about these issues here today, because I think that, as we know the climate is changing, there's nothing more urgent than figuring out how to prepare for the dislocations that are coming and how to adapt ourselves in a way that promotes sustainability and also promotes justice. I am joined by an extraordinary panel, and I am so honored to be able to speak with them today. Abram Lustgarten is a reporter for ProPublica. He writes about climate change and works frequently with the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and PBS Frontline, among others. His book, On the Move, explores how climate change is uprooting American lives and where people will go. Shana Tabak is a human rights lawyer and scholar with expertise in global migration and refugee law, human rights, climate, and gender justice. She's the director of immigration strategy at the Emerson Collective, where she leads work on climate and migration, and she is also an adjunct professor of human rights at Georgetown Law. Beth Gibbons is the director of the Resiliency Office for Washtenaw County, Michigan. She has 20 years of experience working in climate change, sustainable development, community engagement, and environmental policy, including as the founding executive director of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. I want to welcome you all today. Abram, I want to start with you. This book was life-changing for me, On the Move, and it talks about what we can expect as the climate changes here in the United States and how people are going to move. Can you talk us through what we are seeing already and what we can expect to see in the years to come?
Sure. Thank you. It's really great to be here. Thanks for putting this together and having us. I'll start with a really big picture and give you sort of an academic overview of what drove this reporting and this issue. The science suggests that there is a shift in the global niche that humans have lived in for the past 6,000 years. And so what that basically means is that the optimal range of temperature and precipitation is shifting northward on the planet, and as it happens, a very large number of people on the planet are finding themselves living in places in environments that haven't traditionally supported human life. And globally, by later this century, that suggests that about 6 billion people will be living outside of an ideal human habitat, suggesting that some portion of those people will migrate, as they have from the beginning of human time. In the United States, what that shifting niche means is that the optimum environment in this country is shifting from about the middle of the country towards the northern borders, perhaps over the northern border into Canada, depending on what trajectory for climate change we follow, how severe that change is, and how quickly it occurs. And so the premise of my reporting, which I did both out of the country and in the country, was to really consider, how people experience that change environment and what drives an individual's decision to move and where might our demographic shifts lead us. And so in the United States, I broke down available data for some of the driving pressures that are associated with human migration globally, and looked at that across the country. And so that meant looking at wildfire risk, rising temperatures, global coastal flooding and hurricane risk, and the economic damages that are associated with warming, as well as crop yields and what that means for agriculture. And there are more risks than those, but there is good data for those, and that's a sort of simple starting point for how to break it down. And when I mapped those risks across the country, you start to see a very similar picture, regardless of which of those risks you look at. And what that suggests is that the country is being squeezed from the West Coast and the South, and to a lesser degree the East Coast, kind of northward. You see the steepest increase in temperatures along the whole southern part of the country. You see extraordinary wildfire risk on the West Coast, as we know, but also on parts of the East Coast, in places like Georgia, in Florida, increasingly even in the Northeast. There was a rash of fires, we know, in New York and upstate New York this summer. You see rising extreme humidity up the middle of the country through the Mississippi River Basin, the kind of humidity that makes it difficult for laborers to work outside or for kids to exercise, go to sports practice, football practice, that kind of thing. So these real limitations in the southern part of the country, and we don't know how many people will move in response to that or how quickly, but each of those factors are associated with human movement, and it suggests that we could see a population shift in the United States northward towards cooler climates and places with abundant water resources like the Great Lakes. And the estimates for how many people that might be vary widely. One study that I report on measures people at risk just in coastal communities alone and has 10 to 13 million Americans affected. And the other modeling that I did as a part of my reporting suggests that number could be as high as 160 million Americans, so about half of all Americans. So that's a wide range. It's an imprecise figure, but it should give you an idea that we're talking about, somewhere between 1 in 10 to 1 in 2 Americans being slowly displaced by this change, whether they recognize that as the driving factor and flee a disaster, or don't recognize a subtle change but make a move in response to it over the coming decades. And that's the big picture. I'll move it on to Shana, but it suggests a real substantial demographic change over the next several decades in the United States.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think, when we imagine what policymakers could be doing, one side of the equation is, of course, what needs to happen in terms of transitioning our economy away from the use of fossil fuels. But at this point, a certain amount of change is baked in, right, and is already occurring. So Shana, I was wondering if you could talk through the second part of that, how policymakers can, what we should be doing in terms of our policymaking to address the consequences of climate change at both a local, a state, and a federal level.
Sure, definitely, and thank you so much for having me and putting on this great conversation. I think, Vanessa, one of the points you were just alluding to, I think in your question, was the distinction between climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And maybe I'll start there because that's something that, as an immigration scholar for about 20 years and practitioner, I really had to kind of understand the distinction between those two concepts when I started to think more about the relationship between climate and people being on the move. So as you mentioned, mitigation is this question of how are we implementing policies, laws, in order to lessen the impacts of climate change and lessen the emissions of global greenhouse gases so that we don't see these impacts to the extent that Abram was just talking about, and that perhaps we're able to not continue to see such extreme impacts. Adaptation, on the other hand, is this question of recognizing that we've really already passed this 1.5 degree limit that we've set for ourselves through international agreements, and there is some degree of adaptation that humankind is going to have to engage in order to live in places that are impacted by climate. And I would argue that that's really a universal question. I think Abram's book does a great job of explaining and demonstrating how really irrespective of where a person lives, climate change is going to affect us all. And I think that's something that we see both within the United States and globally. So I think that's one of those themes that we really need to, I want to emphasize when we think about what is climate migration and how can we think about policies that we can address to think about that. But since this conversation is focused on climate migration within the United States, I'd like to just share a few of the kind of frameworks that we've been advancing and thinking about with regard to how to address some of those phenomena within the United States. Mitigation is always number one, non-negotiable. That's just always there. It's always in the background. It's always in the ether. Mitigation, extreme, rigorous, and just unrelenting mitigation of climate change, I think, is the first thing I want to start us with. But then I think there are a number of opportunities, and I will also recognize that within the United States, we've obviously just gone through a transition in federal government. And so where I'm sitting at my organization, I'm thinking a lot about, well, what opportunities do we still have, either at the multilateral level, the global phase, the global concept, or within at the subnational level. And I think one of the things that's really important about climate migration is we see that the majority of people who are displaced by climate are actually within borders. And so there are multiple opportunities for us to be thinking about how can we better support local, state, city leaders in order to both better adapt to the impacts of climate, but also to really think about how do we also think about those city leaders and local leaders as people who are going to have to be thinking about how do we integrate people who are moving to urban areas as the coastal areas where they live become unlivable, or as if they live if they're doing subsistence agriculture in a rural area and they need to move toward a city, how do those cities integrate and absorb and accommodate those individuals? So one of the, I think, high-level things that we're thinking a lot about is thinking about ways that we can better share lessons learned across cities and from city to city, thinking about like best ways to adapt, to integrate people who are migrating. And so that has to do with, just absorption, education, housing, sort of your day-to-day like city management tasks that I really don't have expertise on, but that's why Beth is here. And so that's really one area where I think we're thinking a lot about how to think about how to improve support of those individuals. Another thing that I would flag at the federal level that we had really, I think, high hopes for over the past 4 years, and I think that this is sort of a longer-term goal, is the recognition that there needs to be a much more intense degree of coordination amongst different agencies that touch on climate migration. When we think about climate migration, I think about people who are everything from crossing a border because they've been displaced to somebody who is not moving because they either can't move because they don't have the funds or the they just don't have the wherewithal to actually move, or they're not moving because they have a very strong attachment to the place where they live and they don't want to move. And so, for example, there are a lot of communities within the United States that have received federal funding, not a lot. Some communities in the United States who have received federal funding for planned relocation programs. And I think that's an area that we really need to be thinking about. How do we ensure funding for those types of programs? If not through federal funding, are there other types of funding sources that can support communities who do need to relocate? Obviously, there are a lot of really complex questions involved there about, when do we make the decision to move as opposed to just to adapt and, keep moving in, or keep lifting up our houses. But those are, I think, some of the ways that we need to be thinking about how to have change at the local level. The last quick thing I'll mention is the recognition that we're in a very interesting time with regard to the energy transition in the United States. And with the IRA, there have been a number of incredible opportunities for people in red and blue states to transition to the green economy. And those have been very economically advantageous, as I mentioned, both for red and blue states. And so one of the areas that I think we're thinking a lot about is ways that people who are on the move in the context of climate are relocating to cities. How can those people go into job training and skills building that can support the transition to the green economy? I think that's applicable both to people who are moving domestically within the United States, and I know that's not the conversation we're having today, but also for people who might be crossing borders. So thinking about whether there's like an adaptation mitigation sweet spot, if you will, between people needing to adapt to our changing climate, and yet if there are ways that at the subnational level we can better support those people to contribute to the transition to the green economy, that might be an ideal direction for us to think about moving.
Beth, as Shana alluded to, you're really on the front lines of this work in terms of thinking about how cities can prepare and adapt. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And as I was introduced, I'm the director of the Resiliency Office in Washtenaw County, Michigan. And Washtenaw County is located in the southeast corner of Michigan. So we're just adjoined, right next to Detroit. And this is a county which has a really interesting context because it is alongside Detroit, so really rich in its history, in industrial history, but also a county that is 67% agricultural. And so we have this mix. We are also, the seat of the county is Ann Arbor, and Ann Arbor is home to University of Michigan. So we have the opportunity for quite a lot of applied research work, a lot of folks who are bringing forward both best available climate information, thinking about technology transition and thinking about what does the future look like for a place like Washtenaw County, where overall Michigan, of course, has been losing population, but Washtenaw County continues gaining population, and the city of Ann Arbor is anticipated to continue gaining population. And one of the places when we start looking at migration models, looking at where people are going to be forced into motion due to specifically sea level rise, where there might be population going up, Washtenaw County is one of those places. So we have this context here where we have a city which is expected to grow, surrounded by agricultural land, alongside the city of Detroit, which has obviously faced a lot of challenges, but is going through its own kind of renaissance. And so how do we bring forward a future where we're going through our energy transition, we're meeting our climate goals, which include those very ambitious mitigation targets. The city of Ann Arbor has a target of being carbon neutral by 2030. The county has a target of having operations be carbon neutral by 2030 and the entirety of the county being carbon neutral by 2035. But how do we do that in a way that also is bringing forward an equitable and a fair transition and thinking about the way climate impacts are being felt across the whole county. We also want to think about it as like our relationship to Detroit. If we're going to grow as a region, if we're going to attract people here, then what does it look like for us to be actually a welcoming place and creating a sense of belonging? And I think that to Shana's point, when we were thinking about energy transitions, some of the work that I'm most excited to be developing right now is creating these models, which we call our shared energy future, which is talking community by community and saying, if you're going to be participating in us reaching our carbon neutrality goals, is this something that you want to be doing through solar, through wind, through hydrogen? We have a hydrogen hub coming into the county. Additionally, how would you want to be integrating your approach to transportation and housing? And lastly, as you think about these energy futures, what will it look like for you to be keeping people here if you're a community where you want people to be staying, your young people to be staying, and how do you want people to be welcomed as they arrive, as you kind of begin building these different economies and energy futures? And a lot of that is trying to make sure that those communities and the residents there are really owning the narrative for the future and not having that narrative handed to them because of the goals that either the city of Ann Arbor or the county has been setting, but rather that they're actually developing their own future. So I guess there, we're kind of walking this line of trying to be someplace that's ready to receive people, trying to meet ambitious targets, but also trying to keep ownership in the hands of the residents.
So I know you're working locally, but also you've worked nationally on this issue. And this is a question I want to start with you, Beth, but open to everybody. So what about places, like my home state of California, right, where the consequences of climate change are already being felt? What kinds of measures should cities be thinking about when they certainly will have to cope with more disasters and sort of longer-term issues like rising heat, and they may see population decline in the longer term?
I mean, It's the conversation of whether or not climate impacts are going to be with us is out of, like, the cat is out of the bag. Like, we're living in a changed climate. And I think one of the most compelling ways that we bring people along on a conversation about climate change isn't to talk about the change that is coming, but the change that is already with us. And in that context, we are able to say to people, well, what has the change been? How has precipitation changed here? How has temperature changed here, et cetera? And when we think about what are the kinds of impacts that we need to be adapting to, I look around the country and I look for really the most both forward-looking adaptation plans, and some of which are being followed and some which are not always being followed. So one of the most advanced adaptation communities is Broward County, Florida, a coastal community that's been working really closely for a very, very long time with their economic development community, really thinking about what does resilience look like in this place, where have we already lost land, where do we know that we're going to have more vulnerability, in making planning decisions and development decisions in alignment with their business community to be prepared to draw back from certain areas of the county to then make sure that they're developing economically in places that are safe. I want to just highlight another case that you can have really incredible climate adaptation plans. You can be doing really forward-looking, what are called threshold analysis and trigger analysis, so that if something were to change, then we will do this. And one of the greatest examples of that is from Santa Cruz, California. However, they have a wonderful adaptation plan. It's set in triggers and thresholds. If such a thing happens, if a storm comes and we start to see our cliffs erode within X feet of the street, then we will consider closing the street or we'll back off. However, when they experience that impact, they then have struggled to follow their plan. And so excellent planning is key, but the political will for execution on that plan is even more important. And so knowing that change is with us, preparing for what is here, knowing what is coming, but then maintaining that political will to take action when it is time is so important.
I was just going to say, the two things that pop up the most in my reporting is the need for housing and the need to address or at least be prepared for gentrification and to preserve affordability as these cities change. And the demographic shifts that I see don't suggest, for example, that like everybody's going to leave the state of Arizona and it will be a wasteland. It suggests an urbanization and a concentration of population in those cities. So you might see a real hollowing out of rural areas across Arizona or across West Texas, but the city of Phoenix continuing to grow astronomically and thrive, or the city of Houston continuing to grow. And so the challenges become, they're like all the planning challenges and all of the progressive climate policies are nice and are needed, but they're also just really basic things that we've always had to deal with, like housing more people. Atlanta was a real focus of my reporting because it's a nexus of migration from people from Florida or Louisiana or the coast of Georgia, and they've struggled with housing. And one direction that they've gone in is a tax policy that protects against the appreciation of properties, that just protects the assets and the livability of families that have been in a home for multiple generations as the city around them gentrifies and appreciates in value and so on. So,
actually, I want to follow up on this point because we're talking about housing and we're talking about gentrification. And so to me, that raises the broader question you already been talking a little bit about of economic inequality in the United States and racial inequality in the United States, and how the changing climate is going to I think potentially seriously exacerbate those problems, and more broadly, what can we do to prevent that and even turn it in the other direction? Like, can the problems of gentrification, can the problems of housing, as we're dealing with those problems in the context of climate change, can we do something to actually improve the disparities that exist between the rich and the poor and black and white in America, even before the climate started changing? I picked an easy one.
Well, maybe I'll just give an example of what you're talking about in case it's not immediately obvious. I mean, I think we talk a lot in the climate and mobility space about this lens of climate justice that you refer to, which is this concept that historically marginalized populations are oftentimes the ones who are most impacted by climate change, and also those are populations who are oftentimes least responsible and have least benefited from from the generation of wealth that climate has that has led to the climate crisis. So I think one of the examples that we see this in very clearly is when we think about what happened in Katrina and ways in which people in New Orleans were able to either, massive numbers of people were displaced from New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. And it's very interesting to look at who was able to have the insurance payouts and who lived on higher ground, and thinking about where different populations, Black and brown populations that had lived in more vulnerable areas, more coastal areas, and that were less insurable and weren't able to have the money to then return back to their homes. And so we saw a lot of people during that time and during that massive climate displacement, where people think that they are just temporarily being displaced by climate, and then the economic infrastructure, which privileges certain types of people with historical backgrounds of wealth, those individuals are better able to rebuild and return home because they have the financial resources to do so, whereas people who don't have access to that sort of financial support found themselves, years later still in Atlanta or wherever they had fled to. And so one of the concepts that to me is really helpful with thinking about climate and migration and the relationship between climate and migration is this notion of temporality, this idea that climate migration can either be, okay, I'm just going to leave temporarily because of a rapid onset climate disaster, but then there's always these questions of if and when somebody can return. And oftentimes they desire to return, but then these justice-related questions and financial questions really affect whether or not they can.
In order for us to do climate work effectively locally, we have to be able to talk about housing. There's just no way that you get to stand in front of a board of elected officials and bring forward a topic of any sort if it's not addressing housing and sheltering. I mean, we have a housing crisis. It is consistent everywhere. It's consistent in Washtenaw County as well. And what we've seen, so something we're working on really specifically right now in the county is that within the city of Ann Arbor, they are trying to build, I think, 40,000 new units of housing in the next 10 years. They're doing a massive amount of housing development. The last 20 housing developments that happened in the city of Ann Arbor, 18 of them were electrified. And so they're full electrification, and that was both in PUDs and also by right developments. So we've seen this shift that's happened over the last several years in the city of Ann Arbor where developers are opting into doing electrification. We're trying to now look at why has that happened? What has been both the enabling conditions in the ordinances and the zoning codes? What have developers learned? And what has the advocacy community in the city of Ann Arbor learned that can now be transferred across the entirety of the county? Because there are 28 developments happening across the county currently, and we want to make sure that those are all also electrifying. And we want to do that because in the end, energy burden is really critical, that we're lifting the energy burden from our low-income communities so that they are more able to have access to the things that they need to live healthy, whole lives, that they're feeling less threatened, that they're part of the welcoming community for those who may be arriving. So we're really thinking about that coupled approach to climate and housing and taking advantage of having a city that sits on what I like to say, Ann Arbor sits on the bleeding edge of what's possible when it comes to climate policy. So how do we learn from them and then extend that across the broader region?
I would just say, we have an extraordinary backlog of inequity issues that we have a deep hole that I don't know how we climb out of, and it's structural, and a lot of it goes back to redlining housing policies of earlier, last century. I write in the book about how formerly redlined or minority neighborhoods in Los Angeles, for example, are 10 degrees hotter. They have less tree cover. And in urban areas across the country, poor and minority communities in urban areas have less tree cover, so they deal with heat in a different way. Those same communities have seen for decades less investment in the kind of infrastructure that once might have seemed nice and now seems essential in the face of climate change. So like flood control infrastructure or water treatment infrastructure in places like Jackson, Mississippi. And so these are extraordinarily expensive problems, backlogs of problems to get in and fix, and it's troublesome the way, the availability of funds to address those problems is so dependent on a local property tax system, which can perpetuates those same patterns. Right? It takes higher value properties in wealthier neighborhoods and makes more money available for the kind of changes that are really needed in places that don't have the wealth to do that. And those poorer neighborhoods just don't have the tax base to make those changes fast enough. So it seems to be what's needed is a real infusion of extraordinary amounts of money from the state and federal level, which I am not optimistic that we will see. But that's really, those are the tangible changes that are needed to even out some of the inequities.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right to point to the property tax is really implicated in both the history of inequality, right, with segregation and the sort of creation of islands of privilege surrounded by communities that simply had less. But this is going to be exacerbated so seriously by climate change. You can see already in the data that communities that are hit by hurricanes struggle to, they have to pay higher interest on their debt, right? So it means they struggle to raise the money they need for adaptations, but those effects are larger in majority minority communities. So so it's basically sort of a ratchet effect on existing inequalities in our tax code, and I think you're exactly right. I want to, those of you who know me know that taxes are my thing. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about this issue in terms of when we think about the things that need to get done, both in terms of where are we going to find the revenue, and also how can we incentivize the changes to the economy that will make there be less need for adaptation in the future. How are folks thinking about that? On a very local level, say in Michigan, how are folks thinking about that more broadly? And is that something that a lack of action at a federal level basically precludes a serious solution? Or can things be achieved on this revenue question in other ways?
Climate work is hard. This is hard work. Good social work is hard work. Can it be achieved in other ways? It has to be achieved in other ways. It was a relief to feel supported in doing work of climate and justice over the last several years, and not having federal support over the coming years is the reality that we're going to be in, and that's okay. We'll make it work. When you ask, how do we pay for it? A budget is a reflection of your values. So you budget what you care about. And when you, and I guess I'll go back to what I said, you can't set up a conversation of, is it climate versus housing? They are linked, they are well-being, they're what our residents need, they're what our communities need. And so you start to find ways to do integrated work. That's what's necessary. And I think for us in Michigan, we're incredibly lucky to have had a really, really aggressive state government that has been successful in bringing a lot of federal resources to the state. And we expect to keep seeing those resources move to the local level. And then, again, in Washtenaw County, we are really lucky to be co-located with University of Michigan and a couple other large institutions that are very dedicated in bringing both resources and best available information to support our community. So it's always hard, but I think of the core of it is your budget is your value. So if you say you value something and your budget doesn't, then you might not.
All right, so I want to bring the two parts of the conversation together, right? We've talked a little bit about the places that might, see population decline, rural areas, places that might see, urban areas in places that are seeing a lot of climate risk nonetheless growing. We've talked about places that might be communities that are receiving people in the years to come. But Shana, you have a wonderful way of talking about these things together in terms of how we can think about policies that help people stay where they want to stay and policies to help people to go if they feel they need to go. Can you talk a little more about that? Because I think it brings all these issues together.
Sure, absolutely. I think I'll maybe just start from the very personal and how I got into this work, and I think that actually led me to this kind of, I don't want to say epiphany but I think the framework of helping people stay, helping people move is helpful. So my background, as I mentioned, is as an immigration scholar and practitioner, and I started to think several years ago about, I was up in the middle of the night thinking about global warming and how it was going to reshape the world because I'm a thinking person and I thought a lot about it. And then came to this recognition of obviously of how, as Abram was talking about, how these forces are reshaping really this question of habitability, where people can live on the planet. And so as a person thinking about immigration, I initially was thinking, well, how can we frame migration as adaptation to climate? How can we view migration as a positive, as a net positive? And I think that is still important. But I came to realize that I was really only seeing, I think, half of the picture when thinking about climate and helping people move. And in fact, maybe even less than half of the picture. And, this is zooming out a little bit, but in other aspects of the work I do in this space, I work in the global context and have worked a lot and learned a lot from some of the climate leaders in the small island developing nations, for whom the framing of climate migration, the idea of let's migrate to escape or survive or adapt to our changing climate, was actually the worst possible thing that could happen. A colleague of mine talks about planned relocation in small island developing nations not as a contractual agreement that's a success, but as a eulogy for their communities, for their way of life. And so when I think about how we need to frame out the quote-unquote solutions to this challenge of the way in which climate is reshaping habitability, I think about, as I said, how you help people move safely. How do we ensure human rights protections, legal pathways, stability measures for populations who are displaced, protection for people who are displaced, because obviously if someone is living in a temporary refugee camp, for example, they're going to be more vulnerable to climate impacts. But even more importantly, how do we help people stay? How do we help people adapt, build resilience? And I think that question is one that's super, super important, both within the United States, but also in the global context. And that also gets back to your original question about money. It's not just about political will to allow people to safely move and passing laws that allow people to safely move, but the question of how you help people stay has a lot to do with, on the global scale, global climate finance. How do we unlock funding in order to help people build resilience and stay? And so too, just as well in the United States, that is the same question. How do we ensure that people who want to stay safely in their communities can do that? And then I think there's this really just existential question of when do we move from this trying to build resilience, trying to remain safely in the place where we want to call home, and then when do we decide that actually the scales have tipped and we need to move?
Yeah, I wonder if you, in your reporting, you bring together sort of the data about climate change and migration with these stories of people who are thinking about the problem at an individual level. Can you talk a little bit about how people who are in places that are they're seeing the effects today, how they're thinking about the decision to stay or to go?
Yeah, I would say, all right, so I focus my reporting, and there's a lot of people writing about climate migration, and we all tend to grab onto the story, the dramatic story, the examples of people who are moving and say that they're moving because of climate change. And that's a portion of the people that are out there. But I would actually say that most people don't think about this, that they might be pushed by the same forces that we're talking about and not know it, or not know what to call it, or not know how much it weighs into a really complex set of factors, like there's a job opportunity further north, or their kids' grandparents live in a northern place, and by the way, the smoke's been really bad the last couple seasons, so why not take that job? Those kind of intermixing of factors. So it's difficult, it's difficult to answer. I don't think that in large numbers, when you go across this country in particular, that people are thinking a lot about how climate change is going to change where they live, but you see indicators in small ways. You see surveys from real estate firms, that reflect that on a very local level, maybe a block by block level within a certain city, people are thinking about the flood risk or wildfire risk to a home that they want to buy or sell. So, I think it's kind of early stages in that thought process. And then from there, it gets very muddled and very complex. I spend some time in the book with a woman named Colette Pichon-Battle, who lives in. She's a climate activist, but also a resident of southern Louisiana. And I tell her story because her community is like this crossroads that, to me, illustrates how totally contradictory all of the issues we're talking about can become. So there's no real clear through line. So she lives in a community north of Louisiana that has seen a great influx of residents moving there as southern parts of Louisiana have been flooded or become less habitable after Katrina, but also just from regular annual subsidence and loss of land in Louisiana. And at the same time, her community was affected by Hurricane Katrina, and the poorer parts of her community are being pushed out, and people are displaced from climate-related factors. And so she moved back to that community to try to resist, this transition, to kind of try to save, the community that she recognized and she identified with over many, many generations there. Her family is Creole and has been there for hundreds of years. And through that process, which she continues, to advocate for today, she also learned about, the real, undeniable fate of the Louisiana coastline, which is to say that a lot of it's disappearing. And so whether people want to stay or choose to leave or want to leave in an organized way or can't afford to leave, they can't stay where they are. And that's not going to be every community, but there are going to be places that will never have the funding to be resilient and will simply, disappear or become totally uninhabitable. And so she's in this town called Slidell, Louisiana, and all these things are happening at once. Their tax base is growing, their population is growing, wealthy people are moving in, poor people are being pushed out, and it faces a long-term, really, pessimistic future. And that's kind of a little microcosm of what I see happening in places across the country.
So, Abram, and maybe also Beth, do you think it's important for people to see the changes that they're grappling with in terms of climate? Or is that something that, is a way that, we can talk about national trends, but is not, because, as a political scientist, the categories people are using to understand the world and the challenges they face will affect their capacity to choose solutions. And to follow up on what Beth was saying about how important it is for people who are experiencing these effects to be able to participate in the decision-making of those changes and of those policies. So do we think, is understanding these changes as climate change an important part of that?
Yeah, I think it's critically important for the reasons you just said, right? I mean, if we don't have some sort of collective agreement about, what the challenge is, then there's no collective motivation to address it. And the greatest way to make a difference in terms of all of the issues we're talking about in climate change, is through large-scale policy and voting. So you have to have that momentum. I will say, as sort of an aside, or maybe you're headed this direction, but I'm doing a lot of reporting in communities that don't think a lot about climate change and that politically aren't inclined to support any of the kind of solutions or actions that we're talking about. And what I find in those communities is that they are also thinking about what I call climate change. They're deeply affected by environmental changes in their community, and they're responding to it. They're responding to it politically and socially and in all sorts of ways, but not necessarily in the same way that we might describe as, as most productive. And they use a different language to do that, but there, there's no shortage of grievance about, how their agricultural opportunities used to be different than they are today, or there used to be more water, or it didn't used to be as hot, or it didn't used to be as expensive to, heat and cool their homes, and on and on and on. There were more animals when they hunted. I mean, so this is, I think we're at a stage where this is universally affecting everybody, and there's not so much denialism of it. It's an intellectual process of, what do you call it? How do you choose to address, or what do you think are the solutions to the problems that you see? But everybody sees problems.
Yeah, I just want to kind of jump in on that. I think it is becoming a universal concern, but then we also have to be mindful as we go into community to have these conversations that we're meeting people where they are and what their concern is. What is the language that is resonant here? How are the impacts of climate change or the considerations of energy transition present in your lives? I was in a meeting recently with the communities on the west side of our county, the rural communities, and somebody looked at me, and we have what is called the Resilient Washtenaw Plan. This is our plan where we set out to be carbon neutral in operations by 2030 and carbon neutral across the county by 2035. And one of the township representatives said, well, do you think that we're all going to be needing to do the same thing? And I had to really catch myself to realize they were asking me a real question. Did I think that all of those townships would be doing the same thing as Ann Arbor or the same thing as the more urban east side of the county? And I had to pause and say, no, I don't think that is what's going to happen. I'm hoping you'll invite me to your community and we can talk about what are the elements of this plan that are meaningful here and meaningful to you. My expectation is not that this looks the same in all places, but I do think that we can be coordinated towards a shared goal. And they needed that answer more than I appreciated at the beginning of their question.
So, sort of following along this train of thought, I think that, all three of you, and it's wonderful because you all do it in different sort of lines of work technically, but you're all communicators about climate change, right? And it's hard to talk about climate change. Right? There's so many sort of tripwires. Even something as simple as, we don't have a way of doing verbs in English for things that are happening now and happening in the future. We have present and future, and we act as if they're different, right? So it's very hard to talk about ongoing effects likely to worsen, right? And so there are all these tripwires, right? So for example, it's vitally important, I think, that we talk about that some communities are going to be differentially affected, right? Poorer communities are going to face particular problems due to long-time, inequities in our politics, in our economy. And at the same time, climate change is going to affect all of us, right? This is not a limited problem, it's a universal problem. So that's a difficult balance. Or to pick another example, you can think about, on the one hand, this is extremely urgent and frankly quite frightening. And on the other hand, maybe talking that way just encourages apathy, despair, people not listening. And so I struggle with these questions. I know a lot of people do. And I was wondering if each of you could sort of chime in to talk about how you think we could improve the way we talk about climate change, or to use Beth's much more snappy language that she suggested to me earlier, what's the one thing you'd change about how we talk about climate change? Right?
So my number one thing of how not to talk about climate change, I'm really frustrated by the language of climate refugees. This has come up. It's frightening. It's not a real term. There is not a convention for environmental refugees anyway. And we actually just saw a new study come out from University of Michigan where they were doing testing of how to talk about climate and migration, and found that when these topics are combined, it creates a greater fear of migrants. And so we have to be really thoughtful about not using language that causes a greater reaction of fear and a reaction of othering is what it comes down to. the other piece, and I almost don't need to say this because Shayna has said it so much, but just dispelling the notion of where are people leaving and where are people coming to. That our futures are linked, whether there are people who are leaving coastal Carolinas to come to Southeast Michigan. The necessity of conversation between our communities is really present. The necessity of creating supportive systems for people who are in motion is really present. And just really thinking holistically about the dignity of those who are experiencing the climate crisis, which we all are in various ways. But when somebody begins considering, am I going to stay where I am or am I going to go someplace new, making sure that they are having as much support through that process as possible, and not that we're treating them as having two different experiences. Now they're leaving, now they're coming. No, this is a whole life, and seeing them as whole in that way.
This is a really, really hard question, I think, and I'm glad that Beth took one of my 3 top answers, because I also really dislike the climate refugees framing, also because I am a lawyer and legally there is no such thing as a climate refugee, and we can talk more about that, why that is later. But, I think if I could change one thing, I don't know, I have this sort of intrinsic belief that people, I don't want to say this is maybe a cynical perspective, but people act in their self-interest. And I would like for us to have this conversation around climate and migration, climate and habitability, with the recognition that, as Beth mentioned, we are all interconnected in this context, that none of us are able to escape the impacts of climate on where we live, and our capacity to escape them or to survive better, if we have that capacity, is all tied up in really our resources. So I think that in terms of framing, just to kind of break it down and go really simple, I think one of the things that really irks me when people talk about our climate is this concept, and you don't hear this as much anymore, but is like, save our planet, save the earth, our warming planet. Yes, like, our planet's important, but like, we all live on the same planet, and there's nobody in this room who doesn't live on planet Earth. So I would love for us to be able to think about, like, is there that universal recognition of our interconnectedness is something that, as an optimist, you have to be an optimist if you're a human rights lawyer. I like to think that there's a way in which we can appeal to policymakers, to consensus builders, to the people who make these decisions, to recognize that we are really all affected by this, and nobody's zooming off to Mars, although maybe some people have plans to do that.
Okay, this is a very difficult question. I'm going to try to offer a couple thoughts, I guess, from a media perspective, which is just a partial answer. But just to say that communicating around climate change is really hard. And it's hard in a lot of ways. I think the media has done, to generalize the media, an awful job historically, has been improving, but has a long way to go. And it's in the context of a really difficult business environment. Most of your sources of information are for-profit businesses, which are threatened and disappearing, and can't figure out how to do their own jobs on any subject, let alone climate change. And then you throw in the mix, a subject matter that is technically complex, scary and unattractive to readers, and generally overwhelming, even as a reporter, to really consider. And then you're trying to engage readers, right? The essence of communication is the words you use and the stories you tell, but it's also like, can you connect with people? And if people don't engage with you back, there is no communication. And so you have this very, very, very layered problem, from financial to subject matter to the politics of it. And it's a hard environment to work in. And so then how you solve that is something I think a lot about, and I teach about in journalism courses, and there's also no clear answer. And I find myself sort of wavering, waffling back and forth when we've gone from disaster porn kind of coverage to like the shock of, uninhabitable Earth kind of portrayal of like, grabbing people by the lapels and just saying like, your world is, ending. It's the impending apocalypse, to an emphasis on, solutions, because the desire that I hear from the public is that like we want to know what to do, what's actionable, what's give me something positive I can work with. And for me, that pendulum is swinging back, a little bit into the middle somewhere. And I think that there's different audiences for different approaches, and that there is no like best way to communicate about climate change. Some people will be most impacted by seeing the wildfires in Los Angeles as evidence of the apocalypse, and they'll finally start paying attention to, the disastrous picture that the science suggests, we should be paying attention to. And others will never pay attention to that and will glom onto, just one little piece of advice about what can you do, some sort of solution in their community. And so, I think that we have to, some of us have to answer each of those needs in, in different ways at different times. I advocate for, fact-based storytelling. I talk a lot about the book, not being advocating a particular approach or or a political stance on climate change so much as just trying to give people tools to put language to changes that they see in in their own lives. It really doesn't matter what you think about the policy of climate change, but if you can't figure out why it feels a lot harder to live where you live right now, then here's some evidence that'll just like flush out that context for you. I also just think storytelling and straightforward communication without trying to steer, the result is effective, which is partly why, and I won't take us far down this rabbit hole, but I disagree about the use of phrases like climate refugees. As a writer, not as a lawyer, but as a, as a writer, it's a very effective phrase because people understand what it means and it conjures something meaningful and emotional in a response to them, which is the whole challenge of effectively communicating.
So I want to, I'm going to bring in a couple questions that we received online in advance from our audience, and because I think I'm going to share a couple of them at once, and you can answer them specifically or the sort of what I think of as sort of a theme between them. I think one of the challenges we face, broadly and in the context of climate change, is the possibility of confronting a problem and turning to sort of a lifeboat ethics framework for thinking about solutions, right? So I'm going to read a couple of questions that we got. So one is, what measures are being taken to protect the Great Lakes from overuse? And then, how can communities with high cost of living be prepared for displaced individuals without exacerbating the cost of living crisis? So I think there's a sort of a similarity between these questions because they are about resources in communities that will be welcome in receiving people. And how can we think about making those places welcoming and also protecting the people who are already there from displacement themselves?
I didn't quite understand the second question. Can you say that again?
How can communities with high cost of living be prepared for displaced individuals without exacerbating the cost of living crisis?
Oh, building more housing. No, I mean, sometimes we don't need to, like, if it's getting rainier, we should have bigger storm drains. This is also, like, just to let the cat out of the bag about how we prepare for climate change in the Great Lakes region. When I started thinking about in-migration to the Great Lakes region, this was about 7 years ago, and it was really in a question that was, how do we get people to act on climate in trying to do adaptation work, and looking around and saying, well, the Great Lakes region has our share of risks, especially this overabundance of fresh water, which often comes in the form of massive storms, which we're not able to manage in our undersized storm drains. However, we also can look around and see that we are facing less risk. And so is there a way that we start to recognize how industry and agriculture might be shifting into our region, and then bring along philanthropy, bring along those who are stewards of the lakes themselves? So the Great Lakes are 20% of the world's surface freshwater. I think they are one of the most valuable assets that we have in the world. And how do we think about stewardship of the lakes in a context where we want to see our region thrive, and then also avoid a zero-sum game between the 8 states of the Great Lakes region. So if we all think together about what is the opportunity for growth and what is the opportunity for us to thrive here as we see industry, as we see agriculture, as we see people come into our region, how do we do that in a way that cares for the lakes? So that was the original question that I was hoping we would work on answering at that time as I was with ASAP, and then worked on that question together with the NOAA RISA program and with a number of researchers. So, I think that there are many ways in which we care for the lakes. The Great Lakes Commission, we have the Great Lakes Water Compact, and so it becomes a really good, I think that the Great Lakes region is just a great region for us to think about really large regional scale environmental stewardship plus economic opportunity. Oh, and then the other one is just houses. You build more houses.
All right, I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience, but I think, we've touched tangentially on this a couple of times, but the sort of federal context in which we're operating. We're talking here about domestic climate migration within the United States, but obviously climate change is a global problem, and so at this exact moment in DC, we've seen a flurry of executive orders from the new Trump administration that many of them are about climate, and some of them are about immigration. And I wonder, Shana, if I can just call on you as putting on your human rights hat and your immigration lawyer hat, and in addition to your climate hat, so many hats on your head, if you could talk a little bit about what those orders mean when we're thinking about climate migration here at home.
That's just a small question. All right, so I'll try and be brief, but in wearing all those different hats, as you mentioned, some of the most consequential orders that have come out in the past couple days are, none of these are really surprises, right? Like basically a defunding of any of climate offices, pulling out of the Paris Agreement. These are climate actions that we expected to happen yesterday, and they did. In the migration space, I don't know how closely everybody's watching, but there's been a flurry of activities, some of which was expected, some of it was not. But I think the major things that we've seen over the past couple days are things like the pulling of protections like humanitarian parole, a closing off of the refugee system, which obviously contradicts our international treaty obligations. Reinstating the Remain in Mexico policy, this idea that people need to wait on the Mexican side of the border, and proposed end to birthright citizenship. So there's a lot there, and obviously it's all going to be challenged in the courts over the coming weeks and months. But taking a step back, I think that the reason that the executive orders on climate and on migration are important and how they're connected to the question of climate migration, we've seen unprecedented numbers of people on the move globally in the past 10 years. Every year, the number of people displaced, whether within borders or across borders, globally has increased. And we see that increase, and we also see in the climate context, we see unprecedented global warming. Also, that's a trend that's moving up. And the work that I do is really aimed at getting global leaders to think about, might there be a connection between the recognition that as the climate shifts, so too people's capacity to live in the places where they live also shifts. What's really hard about this, and I think when we get back to these executive orders, what's really hard about it is it's very difficult to do any predictive modeling because of the lack of a causal relationship between between climate and why a person moves. As Abram was saying, very few people say, climate is the one thing that is pushing me away from where I live. And so even the previous administration in the United States, which was amenable to these conversations and open to thinking about the intersection between climate and migration, there was no such thing as a climate visa. People have talked about these sorts of things, but so I think the way that I think about solutions from a legal context for climate migration cross-border has to do with recognizing that more and more people are on the move, more and more of those people are impacted by climate. And so we need to just do a much better job globally of creating broader systems, better migration pathways, better quote-unquote migration management to recognize that it's the climate that is the crisis, not people who are displaced by climate who pose a crisis. And I think that we can kind of bring that back to the orders from yesterday, because all of those orders are really aimed at continuing to create really chaos at our border, at south of the border. And so I think that, if we want to be thinking better about how to address the ways in which climate is putting people on the move, we need to just do a better job of thinking about migration management and broader policies of pathways that allow people to safely move when that becomes necessary for them. So we can talk more about some of the specifics, but there are a lot of pieces to that puzzle, and unfortunately I think none of the executive orders yesterday are going to do anything to, they're not moving us in the direction that we are hoping for with regard to helping people more safely move in the context of climate.
All right, so I want to make sure that we have some time for audience questions. There are folks with microphones, so if you raise your hand, they will come over to you. Don't be shy. I think we got a couple up here.
Good morning. I was curious, and maybe I missed it, about how insurance fits into all of this. We're seeing issues, you talked about the disparity between those who have resources and those who don't. And then you've got insurance costs increasing. In some states are actually, insurance companies are leaving due to their high costs. So I was wondering, is there anything in here to address the insurance issues?
How much time do we have? You didn't miss it. It's for the conversation in the United States, it's a critical core part of the conversation. I write about in the book how before what we've been reading about California's wildfires, climate vulnerable states like Florida have used state-sponsored insurance to incentivize people to remain in vulnerable places, basically. We've done that by, using the interplay between for-profit insurance companies that don't want to insure places at high risk and replacing that with state-sponsored insurance, which gives people an option when their insurance cancels on them and has the effect of either encouraging them to continue to build on the coasts or in wildfire risk areas or remain there. And that's not entirely a bad thing because those communities need to be supported, but it can be a bad thing and has been when it encourages more growth into those places. So that's sort of the history. And now we, over the last couple of years and especially the last month, I think we really see, the insurance crisis, property insurance crisis coming to a head. I think the big picture is that the insurance companies tell me they don't know how to evaluate climate risk. And so even where they're not seeing losses, they're reluctant to insure against it because a business model doesn't support investing in something that can't quantify. So simple as that. So I think long term, we're going to see insurers back out of property insurance markets across the country. And it raises huge questions about, it just raises huge economic questions because we have a personal asset and saving system based on property ownership. And if property ownership becomes riskier, then that whole system is in question. Short term, you have states, again, like California, stepping in to subsidize insurance where the other insurers are leaving. And that is also snowballing in a totally unsustainable direction. And it's not really clear how that will pan out. California, for example, has subsidized coverage for a lot of the homes that burned in Los Angeles and will likely face claims that will bankrupt its state-run system. And that's a huge problem for the fifth largest economy in the world and a segment of the United States economy what's scarier to me is what happens if there's another fire before they figure out how to recover those financial coffers, and they face the same kind of charges again, and then another fire on top of that, another fire on top of that. And that's the sort of cascading events and kind of crises that the economists I talk to are most worried about. And so we were talking earlier about, you know, the economic challenges of making of adaptation, of making cities and communities across the country more resilient. And I'm really pessimistic about how that happens. And the insurance problem is one of the core reasons, or the lack of state funds in California, Louisiana, Texas, Florida, et cetera. And these subsidized plans go all the way up the coast from Massachusetts to Maine. If states are going bankrupt because they're kind of trying to play catch up and pay for disasters after they happen, they don't have any money to invest in the adaptation proactively. And if the federal government is pulling back on those same adaptation funds, then we just don't have anywhere close. We need exponentially more money than we've ever invested in the past, at the same time that we are seeing less and less funds available. And so it's not headed in the right direction.
Other questions? I think we have time for maybe up here.
Hi, Adam Haas, Brookings Legis Fellow in Senator Tina Smith's office in Minnesota. So climate-proof Duluth, as you reference in your book. I was going to ask another question about insurance, but because you just answered it well, I'll ask a broader question. There's kind of two competing narratives I hear. One is this big macro climate migration, generally going north towards the Great Lakes. I think that tracks from my understanding of kind of post-2050. There's another nearer term migration I'm hearing about, meaning for the housing pressure. So moving from places like New York or California to Texas and Florida. And I think in the near term, at least the data I've seen shows there's more migration happening to the places that are most vulnerable rather than the opposite. So I guess how do you all reconcile that challenge where more people are moving to the places that are more vulnerable right now? And then also, how does that show up with politics? Because I've heard this potential, if this continues over the course of the decade, more people in Texas and Florida could shift the electoral college map. So I'm trying to kind of grapple with those two contradictions of, we clearly should have people moving the opposite direction. That's not happening. What does that mean? How do we think about that kind of decade-long migration that's happening now versus the kind of 3 to 5 decade migration that's likely to happen?
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen, so there was a paper that came out somewhat recently from the San Francisco Fed, which I thought was interesting for them to weigh in, which was pointing at a stagnation in migration to the Sun Belt. So that was, and it was a group of authors who I didn't know any of their names. And I was like, oh, this is interesting because there's not that many people that write about climate migration, even though it's growing quickly. So I'd recommend that to you as an interesting piece on that kind of, potential stagnation. But I think that I'm going to go around your question just a little bit and say that when climate change intersects with any science, there's a really difficult time that has to go through while we start thinking about a future which is not the same as the past. And I'm most experienced with this in engineering, where engineers really want to believe in stationarity, that what has happened is what will happen. And that is not what climate change allows for us to believe or to act within anymore. And so we have to be able to accept a lot more variability and a lot more uncertainty. And when trends start to change, they are changing more dramatically. When that point will come, I cannot say. And so I think that in the conversations which I have in my region, it is about being prepared. It is about being prepared for a change that we can anticipate coming. And the reason that we can is that people have moved because of climate for all time. And even in the US context, whether it's the Dust Bowl or it's moving to the Sun Belt, people move because of the climate. That is a compelling reason, and so we can expect that that shift will come, and we ought to be ready for it, so we aren't just trying to be reactionary to it.
I just add, I think of the first part of your question as a factor of time scale, right? So short term, there's still incentives and a lot of pull, into vulnerable parts, but long term, 5 decades or something like that, I think the trend will be the reverse, and you can pick out, points of maybe, transitions. After the hurricanes in Florida this year, we're reading stories in the Wall Street Journal about, people selling, and this. Just a quick note on the political change. Like, I'm fascinated by this question of, like, how does climate migration change, the political balance and representation in the United States? And I don't know if anybody else has found it, but I haven't been able to answer that question. And the researchers I talked to, the data and the models don't exist, and the understanding of the change isn't solid enough to model it with any certainty. So I haven't found good answers to that.
Yeah, I think that I'd just say that to give you a sense of the scope of the changes you might see, the Electoral College representation of Florida has doubled in my lifetime. And so I think you can easily imagine changes at least on that order, and the changes would certainly be very consequential for our politics. We have reached the end of our time, which is too bad because I want to keep talking with these folks. And I know that there are more questions from you guys, but I just want to take a moment to thank you all for coming, and especially for coming out in this tremendously cold weather. I'm really grateful that you'd weather the storms, as it were, to join us. And I want to thank our panel for their really enlightening conversation that's left me just slightly more hopeful, which I think was the best that was available. So thank you guys so much. I feel much more informed on the issues.